record retention. And then I'll throw it over to Julie to talk about HR, which is probably more interesting than record retention, but we do get quite a few questions periodically about how long should we keep our records. So I'm just going to share my screen here on just a general overview that we provide, that we send out periodically. So some of you maybe have seen this. Again, this is just a broad rule of thumb. And if you were to look in the Iowa code, actually, it does state insurers, agents, agencies, information collected from the consumer and others in making decisions or transactions for 10 years. So that is in the code of Iowa there. So some of this could be dependent on that, but as a broad rule of thumb, usually 7 to 10 years is a good time frame to keep a lot of different things. There are some things that I want to point out that you should be keeping permanently. So any of your annual regulatory filings, tax returns, audit reports, if you have an audit, should be kept permanently. Your bylaws and articles of incorporation should also be kept permanently. Minutes they recommend keeping on a permanent basis. Let's see here, there's financial statements. So again, this is just a broad overview of that. I know some people have been going to more of an electronic environment, and that is okay if you have that information scanned and stored somewhere to get rid of the paper. Just make sure that you probably have a good backup policy in place and are able to access that if needed down the road. But scanning that and having that electronically is permitted, just as long as you can reproduce it. Some things that are more maybe on a shorter term basis, bank statements, payroll records, generally 7 years. Let's see here, canceled checks. Again, that kind of goes with the bank statements and reconciliations, 7 years. Sometimes I'll get the question about your general ledger. So on an interim basis, as long as you have that and complete at the end of the year, I don't know that you need to keep all of those interim months. I would maybe recommend keeping those if you have an exam and they want to look at that for some reason, but your accounting system should be able to allow you to go back and get that information. Well, that is another common question that we get on keeping some of that information. So yeah, that's just a brief overview of record retention. If you would like to see this, you can email me or I can send this to Brian and he can shoot it out to the membership after we're done today. So yeah, are there any specific questions? I don't know if I can see. Doesn't look like there's anything in the chat. Otherwise, yeah, you feel free to shoot me an email. So I'll throw it over to Julie.
You're on mute.
There we go.
There you go.
Something happened and something came up. All right. So yeah, so thanks for having me today. Always enjoy speaking to this group. So I kind of thought a little bit about, what would be a good topic to talk about? And so I kind of just went back to what are the things that are coming across my desk kind of on a constant basis right now. I mean, obviously there's a million different topics that I could talk about, but I kind of settled on kind of 3 areas today, 3 different things that kind of, I feel like maybe there's things that are happening in your environment. I know some of them are, because I didn't want to spend the entire day talking about COVID related issues, but let's be honest, the last year and a half, things have been crazy. And now that the pandemic is kind of maybe starting to settle down a little bit, there's so many kind of ripple effects of things that are affecting us in our workplace. So what I'm going to talk about today are just a couple of different things. I'm going to start off talking about just some kind of hiring best practices. And I don't know how many of you are thinking that you may or may not be hiring, probably a lot of you are hoping that you're not going to have to be hiring. I know within the mutual environment, a lot of times you guys have a lot of really great long-term employees, and that's awesome. I don't know about in your areas that you live in, but I know in the area around us is it seems like hiring is a huge issue right now. Everybody's looking for people. We're kind of wondering, where are all the people at? What are they doing? You know, we don't know if it was some of the unemployment laws that got enacted with COVID-19 or what, or what's happening. But interesting enough, just this morning coming across my email, I had a couple different things come across, and the titles were, and I wrote them down here because I thought it's kind of prevalent to what I'm going to talk about today. The title of one article that said, "Will employers see resignations spike this summer?" And the other one, about 2 seconds later, I got another one that said, "Forget going back to the office," you know, kind of with people who are working from home. It said, "Forget going back to the office. People are just quitting instead." So I thought, you know, what's going on with hiring? So whether you think you may or may not be hiring here in the next little bit, maybe you haven't had to hire anybody for a while, which is awesome. I thought it might be just good for us to do just a little bit of a refresher on, if you do find yourself in the position where you might be looking to add somebody, replace somebody, whatever it might be, what are the things that you need to make sure that you're doing? All right. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. Then a couple other things that are kind of related to COVID-19. We're going to talk a little bit about just some COVID-19 vaccination facts. With the vaccine kind of being out there now, what does that mean for employers? What does that mean for your office? Do you really want your people to get vaccinated? Do you really not care if they get vaccinated? Can you make it mandatory that they get vaccinated? So I have about, I don't know, 3-4 questions that I feel are kind of like the most frequently asked questions as it relates to COVID-19 vaccines. And we're just going to spend a little bit of time talking about that. By no means am I an expert. By no means am I legal advice. But if anything, it's just to maybe put the thought in the back of your mind, like, what am I going to do about this in my office? So we're going to talk a little bit about that. And then we're going to end a little bit on an interesting topic, I think. And again, I've gotten so much information about this. I kind of put it to the side a little bit, and I've really started to read into it a little bit more, because I think it's definitely a reality, and it talks a little bit about mental health in the workplace. And I'll be honest with myself, and I think with a lot of people, it's kind of been a taboo conversation. Like, let's just not talk about it, right? Whether somebody is having some maybe mental health issues. But I think we can all admit that, you know, COVID has really changed that a little bit. And I have some statistics for you a little bit later in the presentation here. And it's kind of staggering. It's kind of staggering what our people are actually going through based on what's kind of happened in the last year and a half. Not just, you know, oh, I'm stressed, but people are really having some mental health issues. And so again, I'm not a mental health expert, but, you know, myself, as well as you guys who are maybe making decisions for your organization, you have to understand and realize this is reality. And what am I going to do? What am I going to do about it in my work environment? What if I have somebody who comes and talks to me about some sort of a mental health issue? Or what if I feel like my employees are really struggling with something? What can and what should we maybe be doing? So without further ado, let's just kind of, I'm just going to kind of chat. I'm just going to have a conversation with you today. And so we're going to start off with this kind of guide to hiring. And as you guys know, you know, the hiring process and hiring people is probably one of the most important parts of owning or running a business. The kind of employees that you have, hiring great employees, keeping great employees, it's so very important. And those employees they're essential to completing the everyday tasks that you try to do for your clients and for your customers every single day. So when it comes to hiring, what are some things that you have to remember and some things that are important? The number one thing I would probably say is, if you're getting ready to hire, is to make sure that you have some sort of a job description. And I know for some of you, you might say, you know what, we've just got a handful of people here in our office. We all kind of know what each other does. But when you're going to hire somebody, they're going to want to know. They're going to want to know what this job entails. So doesn't have to be anything fancy, but even just jotting down, What are the main functions of this job? So I would strongly encourage, if you haven't done that yet, or you don't have any sort of a document that talks about the different roles. And, we've helped some people within, the mutual organization, help them find replacements and help them hire some people. And that's the first place we started. And it was a really great process to sit down and say, what does this person do? So we start with a job description. The next thing that we're going to talk a little bit about, actually kind of going back to the job description, is another good reason that it's important to do that is you don't want to waste your time and your money looking for the wrong person. You want to make sure that you actually understand what you're looking for. So when you get into the interview process, you can explain it clearly, you can answer questions well, and you know exactly what you're looking for. And you can make sure that you match the right candidate to the position that you're looking for. I think we'd all agree that we know that today our job market is very much candidate driven, and it's probably going to be even more so now coming out of kind of the COVID situation. Prior to COVID, we all know unemployment was super low. That's changed a little bit, obviously, just because of what we've been going through the last year and a half. But it is getting harder and harder to find good talent. And honestly, it's getting even more difficult to keep them in our organization because people are becoming more competitive, and people they're willing to reach out if they know that there's somebody good maybe down the road, to reach out to them and say, hey, come and join our team over here. So we have to realize that, we have to understand that. I have a couple of statistics that I've got written down here. One of them is that 74% of employers admit that they have hired the wrong person for a job. I think we all, maybe I don't want to speak for everybody, but I think we can all admit that we probably have down the road at some point hired the wrong person for the job. Kind of going back to what we said about the job description, right? It's another tool then that can just make sure that we're doing our due diligence to make sure that we're hiring the right person for the job. Another statistic here, 40% or 46% of new hires will fail within 18 months of being hired. So it's almost half of the people that we hired are going to fail. And within 18 months of being hired, it's possible that they're not going to be with us anymore. So that's an interesting statistic. And as we all know, this isn't really a statistic, it's more of a statement. A bad hire just equals, it's a loss of time and it's a loss of money. And so again, whether you're in the market to be hiring, you're like, hopefully I don't have to hire forever. I do think in your role within your organization, it's important to be reminded of these things, because sometimes you just never know when you might be in that position. All right. So the next thing I want to talk just a little bit about, we talked about job descriptions just briefly. I'm not gonna, beat that to death, because we all know they're important. But the next thing I want to talk a little bit about is social media. How do we use social media when we hire today? As we know, social media is everywhere, and social media is here to stay. It's not going anywhere. So how can you use it when you're in a hiring situation? Well, I think it's super important that you leverage any social media outlets that you have. And I really think that in some way, shape, or form, social media really should be a part of your recruiting strategy. I know some of you are in small communities. I live in a small community, super small town, but that still doesn't mean that people aren't on social media, because they are, and everybody is. I really think it's the first step for reaching the masses. So whether you have a Facebook site, or whether you just utilize something like LinkedIn or something to that effect, I think that if you really want to reach the right people, you need to think about how you can utilize social media. All right. And one of the unrealized benefits, or probably realized benefits, is the thing about using social media too, is you have the ability to reach those passive candidates. I find sometimes maybe I can be a little bit old school and put an ad in the paper, right? Or do those things that I've been doing for 20, 25 years. And a lot of times though, you're only reaching those people who are maybe searching for a job. What about those people who maybe aren't necessarily actively searching? They're kind of passive, and they see something scrolling through Facebook, or they see something through a social media channel. It's definitely something that, like I said, it's not going away. And so you definitely have to think about how you can capitalize on your social media. A couple things here as it relates to social media is I found some of this interesting. It says we spend an average or an average of 2 hours and 15 minutes per person is spent per day on social media networks. 2 hours and 15 minutes per person per day on social media. If you're talking about my kids, I'm going to tell you that's way more than that. And then I think about myself and I'm like, I don't know, am I spending 2 hours and 15 minutes a day? I could be getting so much more done if I wasn't. But that's a lot. That's a lot of time. Here's another statistic. 88% of job seekers are on Facebook. So if you find yourself in a position that you need to be looking for somebody, 88% of job seekers are on Facebook. Facebook might be a place that you want to think about putting an ad out. 86% of job seekers in the first 10 years of their careers use social media to job search. People are using it. They're using it to job search. 79% of job seekers use social media in their job search. 73% of Americans use YouTube. 68% of Americans use Facebook. And 50% of Americans with a college degree use LinkedIn. So just some things to think about again, as you're thinking about how do you reach those people if you find yourself in that position. Another thing that a lot of times people have, they ask me this question is it legal for me to go out on Facebook and search somebody who has applied for a job with me? So let's say you got a resume in, and you go out to Facebook and you search that person on Facebook. Can I do that? Is that legal? It is legal. I mean, what people put out on Facebook is public knowledge. I mean, you can go out there and you can search somebody, and nobody says that you can't. Now, with that being said, what I also want to tell you is just to be careful, right? So be careful if or when you think you're going to use what you find on social media to make a hiring decision. Because we all know that profiles have information that cannot be used in the hiring process. Let's think about this a little bit, such as things like national origin, disability, or other legally protected statuses, right? Sometimes we might go out on Facebook and see something and we might make a conscious or an unconscious decision based on what we see on Facebook. And so be prepared for that, you know? And sometimes if we're wasting our resources on looking for people, it doesn't really focus on their qualifications. So I hate to say to go out on Facebook and look somebody up and right away you may or may not disqualify them. And that might not be the right thing to do. All right. And the other part is the legal ramifications of that. It's legal to go out on Facebook, but let's say you found somebody, you found that this is the right person. And let's say maybe it was very observable that they had a disability. Maybe you saw them in a picture that they were in a wheelchair or something to that effect. Or you saw them at a certain religious affiliated event or something to that effect. Maybe you saw that they were a Packers fan and you're like, no way am I going to hire a Packers fan. I don't know. Biases, right? We have those. When we see these pictures, we see things. So you just have to be very careful. I have nothing against the Green Bay Packers for either, but just, it was the first team that came to my mind. So just something to be thinking about. So here's what I usually tell people. Here's a better way to use social media is maybe wait until the candidate is nearing the end of the process. So maybe you have a handful of candidates, some that you want to bring them in, talk to them, ask them questions, find out if they're qualified or not. And if you look at one candidate on social media, then maybe you should look at all of them, right? And if you're going to look somebody up on Facebook, then look them all up and don't just pick one or the other. And you need to, and don't focus, maybe focus on their posts, I guess what I'm trying to say, but not all the reactions. Sometimes I think people can get very bogged down by reading a bunch of comments and things of that nature. I mean, if you see something that you think could be very alarming to your organization and can make them not be a good fit, those are potentially maybe the things that you want to consider. All right. But I always caution people to never make a hiring decision based on what they see on social media. Give the candidate an opportunity I think about some people that we have employed here, and if I would have based that solely on what I had seen on their Facebook page, I maybe would have maybe not hired them. I don't know. But to be honest, thinking back, I'm thinking maybe just about a couple people in particular. They were really great people. And, what they do outside of work, sometimes, or what they post on Facebook, it can just be a gray area. So again, I know I'm maybe being a little bit vague and a little bit towing the line here, but I just say to be careful, I guess is what I would say when it comes to social media. Let's see, what else can I talk about that? Let's move on. So the next thing I want to talk about when hiring is obviously conducting a lawful interview. I think that's a question that I get asked a lot too. And it might just be a quick email, or it might be a phone conversation that says, hey, I'm gonna be doing some interviewing. What can I ask and what can't I ask? Those sorts of questions. And, there are so many different laws that are out there that protect employees, everything from civil rights, age discrimination, Americans with disabilities, immigration laws, pregnancy discrimination acts. So sometimes I think for employers, it can be a little daunting to think about, I don't want to get in trouble, right? I don't want to ask something that I can't ask. So then we get either kind of paranoid about it, or we kind of tend to be like, whatever, I'm just going to ask it and see what happens. Well, I guess you can go either way with that. But what I want to do is I want to just give you some examples of probably some of the biggest areas that tend to get people into just some trouble. And I want to show you how you can maybe find out that information without asking an illegal question. So for example, age, right? You can't ask, when did you graduate? Or how old are you? Those are illegal questions. So we all hopefully probably know that. But what you could ask is you could say, do you meet the minimum age requirements for the job? And let's say you had a job description, or you had, they had to be at least a certain age, whether that's 18 or whatever the situation might be. You can ask, do you meet the minimum age requirements for the job? You're not going to find out their exact age that way, but do you need to know their exact age? So that's one thing when it comes to questions that you can legally and cannot ask. You cannot just come out and ask a person how old they are. What about disability? Questions about disability. Obviously, you can't ask, do you have a disability? But you could ask them, after reviewing the job description, can you perform the duties listed in the job description with or without accommodation? So I guess another plug for what we talked about 10 minutes ago is having job descriptions. It's a way that you can say, these are the job functions. A lot of times in most job description, there might also be things like weight restrictions, like you need to be able to lift 50 pounds or whatnot. So if you have a job description and you give it to them and have them read it, and you say, after reviewing the job description, can you perform the duties listed in this job description with or without accommodation? So that's why I think it's super important in your job description also, that if this is going to be a job where they have to stand for a long period of time, if they have to be able to travel, if they have to be able to do certain things, that you include that in your job description, so that in the event that you would ask that question, those things would be listed. Race, obviously, you can't ask questions about race. You can't ask questions about religion. You can't ask questions about marital status. You can't say, are you married, or do you have children? But what you could possibly ask is, are you available for frequent travel? And in the context of their answer, it might come out whether or not they say, well, I do have small children at home, so I'd like to not be gone every night. No, what they tell you in their answer, you have no control over that. What you have control over is the questions that you ask. So again, you could say, are you available for frequent travel? Can you work overtime when required? Can you work evenings? Can you work weekends? So sometimes those types of questions might bring them to talk about whether or not they have children, even though typically that shouldn't be something that is a major concern of if they're qualified for the job or not. All right. Some other things like national origin, citizenship, pregnancy. You can't say, oh, I see you're pregnant. When are you due? So that's something that you just cannot ask. I'm trying to see here if there's other things. some questions around military. You can't ask, were you honorably or dishonorably discharged from the military? But what you could ask is, what experience did you gain in the service that is relevant to the job that you would be doing here? Again, it might not get you to that answer that you maybe ultimately are looking for, but there's just some questions that you cannot ask. All right. So again, going back to volunteered information. So even when you ask only legal questions during an interview, you may receive information that you would prefer not to know from an applicant. And the best way to handle this is to just thank them for the information, not to pursue it, and not make any note of it. You don't want to note, oh, they told me that they're pregnant, type of situation, or they told me you don't put in your interview notes, they're 45 years old. Those are things where if they disclose that, you can't control what they tell you, but I never put anything like that in any of my interview notes, because I never want it to come back to say, well, I hired this person who was 30 and I didn't hire the person who was 50, and somehow they think that it was an age discrimination type of a situation. So I never want to put any of that information in my notes. All right. So just a couple of things here. I'm just kind of making sure that I'm not dragging on and on about this, but I do think that, again, especially if you haven't found yourself in an interview situation very often, some of these things might not just be top of mind, and you might be like, oh, I've asked that before. Well, you might want to rethink that, and you might just want to be careful the next time you find yourself having to interview somebody. I want to touch a little bit on consistency. I feel like one thing that's important when you're interviewing people is just to be prepared and consistently use the same questions for each interview, and try to follow a structured interview process as much as possible, for a few reasons. That way you kind of make sure that you're asking the same questions of each candidate, so that you can compare the answers and you can compare the qualifications. And you want to try to treat each of your candidates as equally and fairly as possible, to make sure that you avoid any complaints of any sort of discrimination issues. So one last thing to talk about before we move on to kind of some of the other topics, so still on the hiring discussion here, is the topic of compensation discussions in an interview process. So you may or may not know this, but there are actually a number of states and cities that are starting to ban employers from asking job seekers to reveal their salary history. So there's states and cities that are banning employers from asking a candidate to reveal what their salary history was, what their previous salary history was. And so I think that you just want to, I don't believe, at least the last I checked, I don't believe that Iowa has banned that, but I know right next door, Illinois has banned that, especially closer into like towards the Chicago area. I think it's kind of starting maybe more in the metropolitan areas and slowly maybe starting to creep further out. So the shift in the conversation is more towards their salary expectations rather than their salary history. So that doesn't mean it's not okay to ask what their salary expectation is, but to say, can you tell me what you're currently making at your current job, or what you've made previously at your previous jobs? So you have to be a little bit careful with that. And so I guess sometimes the way that I think it's better to handle that is maybe just to be forthcoming with the salary range or the salary expectation that the company believes, was in your market value or whatever of the job, and to be transparent about that. And then focus obviously on the candidate's skill set and their qualifications for the role. And then, yeah, like I said, to be honest and say, you know what, our salary expectations for this position would be between X or A and B, whatever. Would that fit within your salary expectations? Now, I know sometimes that's hard and sometimes that doesn't always work. And sometimes that might open you up to be like, oh, well, I said our salary expectation is going to be 50,000 and maybe they would have been fine with 40,000. Sometimes it's hard, right? But I just wanted to make you aware, and I'll try to keep you posted too, if I obviously through the MIAI or whatever, if I hear anything happening within the state of Iowa that specifically says that those questions are banned, I'll definitely keep you posted on that. But I know it was something new, I don't know, probably just in the last 18 months or so. And I just saw something come across about it again, how it is still a real thing. So just be careful. I mean, I'm really just trying to give you some guidance on some areas to be careful. Let's see here. What are some last things? Just
Julie?
some last
Julie.
top of, yeah.
There's one question you want to
Oh, yeah.
answer.
Yeah.
What
Sorry, I
recourse?
wasn't paying attention to that.
Okay. What recourse does the company have if an employee posts negative comments regarding the company on their personal social media?
Yeah, that is a great question. And I was actually just involved in kind of a situation that had to do with that. It's a little bit tricky. You should have, I guess the first thing I would say is if you don't already have, you should have some sort of a policy in your employee handbook. If you don't have a handbook, then that's another step back, but you should have some sort of a policy in your employee handbook that speaks to social media, and it speaks to, something to that effect about how, your employees, they can't disclose customers and clients, and speaking negatively about the organization and things of that nature is frowned upon. Now, where it gets gray is if somebody says something on their own personal Facebook site, that's their personal kind of freedom of speech per se. So you have to be a little bit careful. Now, does that mean that it's okay and it's a good idea for somebody to just go out and say negative things? I do think that if you see that that's happened and one of your employees has said something and it's all over Facebook negatively about your organization, it doesn't seem right just to sit back and let that be, right? So I do think what recourse you have is you absolutely have the ability to call that person in, have a conversation with them. If they're speaking badly about the organization and they're willing to just spread it all over Facebook, there's obviously probably an issue going on. And so it's something that you're going to want to pull them in and have a conversation about anyway. I would be very cautious whether to just call them in and say you're fired because of that. I would first call them in, find out the situation, talk through what's going on, why the need to do this, point out, the policy that you have in your handbook, and see if you can't take care of it that way. Now, if it's very derogatory, very possibly damaging to the company, I would maybe honestly just maybe seek some legal counsel and see what kind of leg you have to stand on as far as if you can terminate that employee. So I would maybe just tread lightly. I know that's not a great answer, and unfortunately it's kind of the world that we live in right now. But at least all the guidance that I've been given is you have to just be a little bit careful. If somebody's putting something out there on their own personal place, they have a right of speech. They do. Now, do they have a right to slam the company and things of that nature? No, they don't. And I definitely think it needs to be handled, but you have to just make sure that you handle it the proper way. So was there another question, Abby? Hopefully that kind of, I know it's a little bit gray. So I apologize for that. I would just encourage you to just really look into that and make sure that you tread lightly and tread carefully when you handle that employee.
Abby, that was my poorly written question. So I'm not asking.
Could you clarify that, please?
Yeah, well, okay, to clarify it is I suck at typing. Let's just say that when I reach the laptop.
Or I sucked at answering that, one or the other, yeah.
Yeah. Julie, thanks for your time, and Abby as well. But can you talk about in this environment the current top 3 benefits individuals are looking for, whether it's for retention of current staff or hiring of individuals? What are they looking for? Our world kind of changed last year.
Yeah.
And has that changed and evolved as well?
Yeah. So like what they're looking for from an employer, like what they're looking for from where they work. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Yep. Yeah. And that's a great question. Absolutely. I want to say that, I mean, obviously with every person, it's probably different. And I want to say that compensation isn't at the top of the list, but I still honestly think, and I think we could probably all somewhat agree that everybody wants to get paid fairly. And obviously in light of what happened over the last 18 months, there was a lot of concern for what's going to happen with the economy, right? And what's going to happen, what's the difference? What if I lose my job? I saw something, and it was just in the last couple of weeks, and I don't know if I have it on my desk, but it was a percentage of people who if they lost their job or whatever, they don't have the means saved up to go, what do they say? You should have like 3 months worth of savings if you would happen to lose your job, right? In the event that would happen. And the percentage was staggering. It's like in the 80% that don't have that. So, I do honestly think that you can't cut compensation out. You just really can't. But I want to say, obviously, in my gut, I mean, without having something that says specifically nationwide, this is what they're saying. I think anymore, it's the work environment. I think the ability to have some flexibility is super important. The culture that you provide, we spend a lot of time at work. And I think those things are very important. And I think that the benefits, anymore, and whether that's, and you can kind of lump compensation and benefits into one, because some people are like, well, we don't offer much, but dang it, we pay well. And when we give lots of paid time off and things of that nature. So I do really think that those things are super important. And I would probably say that those are, whatever pecking order you put those in, are probably some of the most. And I think honestly, some employers over the last 18 months got either kind of a check mark or a gold star on how they handled what happened over the course of the last 18 months, whether that was from being flexible and allowing their employees to be home with kids who maybe didn't have places to go, allowed some working from home work environments, when maybe unfortunately sickness happened, we're as flexible as possible. And I know it was a new thing for a lot of us, and we maybe didn't always know exactly how to handle it. And we were kind of going on the fly with week by week, how do we handle this, right? Because we still have customers and clients that we have to help. But I think that the way that we handled it, and that's specific to your environment, probably spoke volumes for kind of your work environment. And now, even if you look back and you're like, oh, I don't know if I did a great job through all that, you got to give yourself a little bit of grace, because a lot of us have never had to deal with this before. And we didn't have like, oh, this is how we did it last time. We were going through things that we never had to go through before. But I think that your employees will recognize, kind of how you handled that. And that will be a big thing for them. So does that help, Randy? Okay, awesome. What other questions before we completely take off on a different subject? Are there any of the other questions relevant to some of the things that we just talked about? I guess I could maybe look at them myself, but since Abby was feeding them to me, that was so handy.
No, I think you're good to go.
Okay, awesome. So we're going to move on here. I know we got about 20 minutes left. Just a couple wrap up things as we talk about hiring is, I try to remember, and I try to, tell my hiring managers and stuff as we're looking for people is, you're always just looking for the best fit. I feel. So you want to make sure to discuss your culture, and the job. And to be honest, I think sometimes we want to bring this person on. And so we talk about how great and wonderful and maybe sometimes tend to overinflate things. I think the best thing is to just be honest. And sometimes that means exposing your warts and everything. We all have areas where you're like, you know what, we maybe don't do the best in this, but we're aware and we're working on it. Or maybe a new person that we bring in will help us do even better in this area. So I think that's very important. Be honest about how long your hiring process will take. That's one of the things that I sometimes get dinged myself on, or I talk to candidates, or I find myself apologizing because I'm like, I'm so sorry. We talked to you 10 days ago and I haven't gotten back to you yet, because whether things have slowed our process down or whatnot. So I do think, especially if it's somebody that you're interested in, is explain to them how long your process is going to take, stay in contact with them, communicate with those applicants so they know, and otherwise they might just look for something else, or we've had it before where our process has maybe taken too long and we've lost a good candidate. And so just be aware. And again, one last thing is that every applicant should get a response. You know, if you have people who are applying for your jobs, even just a quick email saying and acknowledging that you got their application or their resume, I think is important, because you never know if that's the person that's going to turn into the hire for you. So you always want to try to make a good impression. All right, so that is the quick or not so quick recap of hiring best practices. So with that, I'm gonna take a drink a second. And I'm gonna move on, and we're gonna cover just the last couple of topics that we mentioned. The first one being the vaccination questions. So what I really wanna do is I just wanna kind of hit probably the top 3 or 4 questions that I feel are kind of being posed to employers as it relates to COVID-19. And now that the vaccinations are out there, people are getting vaccinated. The first question is, can employers mandate the COVID-19 vaccine, that their employees get vaccinated with the COVID-19 vaccination? And the answer to that is yes. An employer can implement a mandatory vaccination policy. And you all know this, what's coming next is the but, right? So you in your organization can say it is mandatory for you to work here that you are vaccinated. However, there are some things that you absolutely have to be careful of, all right? So some conditions and some exceptions. So the but part of that is, if you have a mandatory vaccination policy, you have to make sure that you make exceptions or accommodations for anybody who might have any sort of a disability covered under the American with Disabilities Act. All right. So if somebody says, wait, I can't get a vaccine because X, Y, or Z, whatever that would be, that could be covered under the ADA or Americans with Disabilities Act, you have to have a conversation with them about that. And you have to see if it makes sense for you to make that accommodation within your organization. So that's one. The other one is the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and it's actually Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And this is the act that protects employees with sincerely held religious beliefs. So if you said mandatory COVID vaccines in our work environment, and somebody came to you and said, hang on here, it is absolutely against my religious belief, XYZ, whatever that is, for me to get a vaccine, and I will not get one. And what does that mean? Can I no longer work here? You have to have a conversation about that, and you have to be willing and ready to possibly make an exception based on those criteria. All right. So it's not as easy as just saying, you know what, we're just going to make sure everybody gets vaccinated. There are possible reasons why an employee maybe could say, you know what, I'm not going to get vaccinated. What does that mean for my employment? So the next question being, what should employers consider when deciding to make policy mandatory or voluntary? And I think that's really what it's going to come down to. Are you going to be the employer that says it's absolutely mandatory that you get vaccinated? Or are you going to be the employer that says, you know what, we highly recommend it. However, it is going to be voluntary. So if you make this policy mandatory, here's some things to think about. The increased administrative burden that could potentially be there. And what I mean by that is, if you're going to make it mandatory, there is some administrative burden to make sure that you're getting proof that they've been vaccinated. There is some administrative burden to these exceptions that we just talked about, right? So what if somebody says, what about my disability? What if somebody says, what about my religion? You're going to have to sit down and have those conversations and work through that and figure out what you're going to do about that. And then you also have to realize that if you deny any of those accommodations based on their disability or based on a religious belief, that it could provide you with potential exposure to a claim for failure to accommodate. So you could have some sort of a disability, retaliation claim or something to that effect. So those are potential issues you'll have to think about. Discrimination claims, right? Let's say you say, well, I say that this is an acceptable disability exception, but this person over here comes to me with a disability, and I don't think that qualifies as a disability exception. Someone might say that it's a discrimination issue. So you might have to deal with something to that effect. You could be faced with wrongful termination claims. Again, I'm not necessarily advocating one way or another. I'm just saying these are things that you have to think about. Another thing that you could have to think about is, we all can probably agree that there may still be some unknown potential side effects from the vaccine that we don't know about yet. And could those down the road, let's say you said it was mandatory, and the only reason I got this vaccine is because I wanted to work here, and you told me I could only work here if I was vaccinated. Well, now 6 months, 9 months, or a year down the road, it comes out that there's a potential side effect that I seem to happen to have. And could that turn into a claim against me, the employer? We don't know, but I'm just telling you, these are the things that are out there, and these are the things that could potentially happen. So again, as in a lot of the things that I've said today, be careful. Make an educated decision, make a smart decision. Just make sure that you know all the potential things that could come along with that when you decide one way or the other how you want to handle that. Last question as it relates to COVID, and then I'm going to move on to the last topic, is this question kind of around, can an employer offer incentives to employees to get a COVID-19 vaccination? So maybe you say, you know what, I'm not going to make it mandatory. We're not going to make it mandatory because people have some pretty strong feelings. I feel like, I don't know about your neck of the woods, but I think that probably everywhere people have some pretty strong feelings on COVID in general, vaccines in general. So let's say you don't make it mandatory, but you say it's voluntary. However, we are going to provide this incentive to those that are vaccinated. You can do that. You can offer vaccine incentives. Again, it comes with a little bit of caution. You want to make sure that you're not offering an incentive or a penalty so substantial that it is almost like it's coercing or it's trying to get them to do it, right? So maybe it's some sort of if you're vaccinated, it's maybe some sort of health or wellness or something like that, some sort of benefit that has to do with that. But you don't want to make it so substantial that you feel like, well, if I don't, or if I do, it's such an incentive that I feel like it's almost forcing me into making that choice. So again, you can, if you manage your organization and you would just really strongly like your whole staff to be vaccinated, but you don't want to make it mandatory, you want to make it voluntary, but you want to maybe add a little extra incentive for people to go out and get vaccinated, you can do that. Just be careful and maybe look into what those incentives could be and what might make the most sense for your organization. All right, so hopefully that's somewhat helpful. Again, what I want to try to do today is just bring some of these topics top of mind so that you can maybe be even asking the right questions or doing a little bit of research on your own or finding out what are other people doing and just kind of become educated. So the last thing that we're going to talk about for about the last 10 minutes, and I promise I'll get you guys all out here on time because I have a tendency to talk too much, is just this topic of supporting mental health in this post-pandemic workplace, right? So kind of like I prefaced earlier, is I am seeing so much, like literally in just the last week, I have like 4 articles that I printed out that are all about health and wellness coming out of the pandemic. And honestly, it's a reality. We are dealing with a couple of client issues that we're helping with here that have a lot of focus just around teams not getting along, people not working well together. And part of us is we're having a piece of the conversation around, what do you think COVID has to do with any of this? What do you think about COVID fatigue or COVID stress or, some of that? Is that a reality in this issue that you're dealing with some real conflict issues within their organization? And so when we talk about mental health in the workplace, I do know that there's definitely a stigma around having discussions about employees' mental health. And I think that if you'd have asked me, even, I don't know, a few years back, I'm like, I don't like to go there, right? Unless they come to me and they say it, I don't typically go there. But I do agree that, and I think that the pandemic has really created kind of this unexpected opportunity for more open conversations around this topic. I know it is. It's obvious. It's obvious in everything that I'm reading and that I'm seeing and that I'm hearing, that there is more and more of this. And so you can, think, oh, I don't really think we have a lot of issue. And that's great. And maybe you don't, but I just don't want you to turn a blind eye to it either. In the event that you have an employee who you think they might have some sort of issue happening with them from their mental health or mental well-being, I want you to at least sit down and think about it. All right. Because COVID was a reality. It is a reality. And I think it has brought out a lot of these things, and these things are being brought into our workplace. And from everything I'm hearing and seeing too, is the pandemic has a lot of companies, they've recognized it and they are doing things about it. So whether that's you or not, there are things that are happening, which is proving that this is an actual issue that I think that we need to at least be aware of. So we all know we've gone through the pandemic. We're hopefully, cross our fingers, the back end of it. But you also know in the last year and a half, there's been a lot of economic uncertainty. There's been political turmoil. There's been racial injustice. There's been so many things that I think are causing some of these issues. And I do think it's really important for us as employers to recognize, kind of the high stakes of failing to address kind of these soaring rates of mental health problems. And I'm going to give you some statistics here in just a second. And I mean, these aren't my statistics. I'm getting this from data that I get every day. And these problems are causing things that are real problems for us. I'm not saying that mental health isn't a real problem, but it's causing things like rising healthcare costs. If any of you guys offer health insurance benefits, you know what it's like every year when you get your open enrollment rates, right? And you're faced with the potential of even higher, rates for your health insurance, and you try to figure out, how do we afford this? So mental health issues are just going to continue potentially to add to that. It's definitely causing reduced productivity. Let's say people are struggling and they come to work because they have to work, they have to get a paycheck, but they're not feeling well, they're not right. It's causing reduced productivity. And that's a real issue for you as a manager. It's causing and can cause employee turnover, another real issue for you as a manager. So just some statistics, because I think sometimes it helps bring these things into light. It says here, this is just recent stuff. I literally just got, in my inbox probably within the last couple of days, is that 40% of workers today report dealing with one or more acute mental health conditions, such as anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, things of that nature, those acute mental health conditions. So put this into perspective. Let's say you have 10 people working in your organization. You had better bet that 4 out of those 10 are dealing with one of these issues, maybe on various scales, whatever that scale might be, but 4 out of the 10 are dealing with something like that. And that number, that percent, which I just said was 40% today, in 2020, the start of 2020, so maybe 18 months at best, was 20.6. So this body, this mass of people that they surveyed was 20% not even a year and a half ago, and now it's 40%. So what does that mean, right? And it says here, not surprisingly, even more employees are dealing with less acute yet disruptive mental health challenges, including stress, burnout, relationship issues. And I know when I read that, I was like, well, we all deal with stress, right? We all deal with burnout, maybe at some point in time. Can I really control people's relationship issues? Maybe, maybe not. But when you add that on top of that 40% number, and I do think that, obviously in some industries, burnout, stress of what they've had to cope with over the last 18 months is absolutely a real thing. Maybe they wouldn't say they have anxiety, maybe they wouldn't say they have depression, but stress and burnout is absolutely a real thing. And it's a real thing that employers have to deal with and they have to address. And then one last statistic here, it says 48% of employees or workers say that their mental health has impacted their capacity to work over the past year. So half of your employees, so let's say you've got 6 people in your office there, half of them would agree that in the last year, their mental health has impacted their capacity to work for you in your organization. What does that mean, right? What do we do about that? So again, I don't have all the answers for you today, but what can you do about it as an employer, right? So I just want to throw out some things, and I think what works for one doesn't work for another. If nothing else, think about this, right? Think about what you could do. Talk about it. You know what? If you have feedback meetings with your employees, you have conversation with them every once in a while. How are you doing? You know, how are you doing? You know, coming out of COVID, I know it's been a stressful time. How are you doing? How are things going? How are you feeling? You know, just talk about it. Make them feel okay about talking about it. Look at your benefits. You know what? Maybe if your benefit doesn't offer any sort of benefit for maybe talking to somebody in the profession, maybe that's something that you can add. I know sometimes depending on what type of benefits you have, it's something that you can add as an additional benefit. And maybe if you add it and it doesn't maybe all come out of an employee's out-of-pocket expenses, maybe in the long run that could end up helping your benefit costs, your increases, rather, you know, just something to look at. Offer an EAP. I know a lot of employers do already offer an EAP, which is an employee assistance program. And others maybe don't. Maybe this is the time, if you've been on the fence, like, well, we've never offered an EAP before. Maybe this is the year and this is the time to say, you know what, we're going to look at what do we have in our area. Every area has EAP programs. You just maybe have to dig in and find, you know, what's the one that's maybe the closest to you or one that would work for you. And a lot of those EAP services offer a number of free counseling sessions. Maybe it's even just over the phone, but honestly, sometimes that is all that somebody needs, is just a listening ear, somebody to help them in a situation. Think about maybe you need to implement some sort of policy or practice that's mental health oriented. And you're like, well, what could that be? That might just be more so with looking at how you deal with your time off. Maybe in your organization, your time off is strict, it's tight, it's hard for people to request time off, and they need it. They just need a mental health day, right? Mental health day maybe didn't mean as much before, and maybe it means more now. People maybe just need a mental health day, and maybe you need to look at your policies and your practices and say, how easy is it for me to just give my people a day off and just allow them to have a day, just to have that day to reflect and to refresh. So those are some things that I'm reading and some things that are kind of being thrown out there as far as ways to think about how you can incorporate that in your work environment. So before I stop here, I want to just mention, as we're talking about COVID, this is something that I was just reading through today. When we think about what we've learned about our workplace, and we think about what we've learned and what has changed in our workplace over just the last 18 months, we think about how the pandemic has affected us. It's just a list here. And so as employers and managers, I want you all to give yourself a little bit of grace too, because we've all been through a lot of things that we haven't been through in a long time, if ever. You know, we're dealing with things like remote work issues, right? How do we handle this? What's the right thing to do? Do our people work in the office? Do they work from home? Do we do a hybrid situation? Workspaces, you know, what do we do with just our general workspace? You know, some people had to put up shields and things of that nature. That's changed their workspace. Different types of workplace innovations, things like investing in virtual platforms like we're doing today, right? New workflow processes, because my team is in a 60-mile radius. How do we deal with that? Different legal proceedings, things that are coming out from a legal perspective that are coming out of the pandemic. Disaster planning and readiness, right? Maybe a lot of us didn't know how to handle this because we've never experienced this before. And now we're creating policies and procedures to deal with this. Things like fraud, you know, false unemployment claims. There's been a lot of more identity thefts, trying to obtain the benefits that the government was giving out. things of that nature. Social distancing, how do we work in a social distanced world? So think back to all of the things that we as employers and managers have had to deal with over the last 18 months. And it's been a lot. And a lot of those things are going to continue to push forward. And so give yourself a little bit of grace and realize that a lot of us are all in that same boat together. And we're just really trying to do the best that we can. And yeah, with that, I guess I know I'm right at 2:01. So I hope some of that information was informational. Again, I love talking to this group. You guys are always the best listeners, and I always get great questions and things of that. So I really appreciate that. So thanks for having me. And I know you're all busy, so I will not continue to talk anymore. So thanks again. But if you have questions, let me know, and I'm happy to answer them.
All right. Well, thank you, Julie. Does anybody have a quick question they want to pose? I mean, like I said, it's your time. So if you want to stay on and ask questions, I'm open to leaving the Zoom session open. If not, you can always email directly to Abby or Julie, and I'm sure they'd be glad to contact you back with any information, or feel free to email me directly and I'd be glad to get an answer for you. So any questions? I have one, so I'm going to ask it just because
Okay.
I know this came up prior to. So if for back in the hiring situation, if say there's a mutual manager and they're interviewing different candidates, and they want that candidate to actually sit down and maybe just job shadow for 20 minutes after the interview process. So much of the information that we have is obviously proprietary and is confidential. Are we allowed, or is a mutual allowed to have them sign a confidentiality agreement prior to doing that, even though they're not employed yet? So that if they see an insured's name on a policy or something like that, is that an appropriate course of action?
Sure. Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think from a legal standpoint, absolutely you can. I mean, and I would just explain it to them and say, you know what, we'd really love for you to get a feel for the job. But as you know, I guess there's a couple things that you could do. You could either, one, just make sure that you're really diligent about making sure they don't see anything that could be confidential. Maybe you have like a mock client or something like that. I know like in our world, we have like mock tax things that they can do just to kind of see what they could be doing. But you could definitely have a conversation with them and say, you know what, we'd really like for you to get a feel for, you know, what the work that we do. However, just in case in the event that you would happen to, you know, come across some client information or something, would you mind signing this? You obviously make sure that they have a chance to read it and explain the reasoning for it. I don't see really any potential harm in that. And if it makes you feel a little bit better and gives you a little bit more peace of mind, it's probably not a bad thing to do. Now, of course, you always take the risk that you don't know this person very well. And just because they sign that doesn't mean that, I mean, you know, and then let's say you find out that it did get leaked. What are you going to do with that? So I guess my advice to you is just really maybe think through that. And is the value that they're going to get from job shadowing, does that outweigh the potential of, unless you're really confident in this person, and maybe you're like, I'm pretty sure this is the person we want to hire. We just maybe want to do this last step. But I think absolutely you can. I think, and maybe having them sign that is probably the way to do it, just to give yourself a little bit of peace of mind. So that would be my thought. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. There was one other question came up in the chat forum, which is regarding record retention. I know Abby, you've already talked about it. Can you email me that distribution sheet with that data on it? I will send that out to the membership so you have that available to you. If you haven't already received it from Kane Ellsworth, you'll have a digital record of it. Other than that, I really want to thank Abby and Julie for taking the time today to speak to us and give us the information. Certainly, membership, if you guys have any topics you'd like covered, please let me know. I would be more glad to line up speakers and have a Zoom discussion about it. So, well, thank you, everyone. Have a good afternoon, and we will see you again down the road shortly.
All right. Take care. Thank you.
Thank you.